And if we do not capture that spirit, we will soon be obsolete ourselves, as an organization. So that is, briefly what we mean by a little progressive, little open-minded. And also the university cannot be as an organization that works in the ivory tower, but very much engaged in social transformation, upholding the value like equity, justice, peace, inclusiveness, that kind of a thing. So,
wow, sounds good.
So this is all up in the air, We would like to invite you someday to see it for yourself. And you should remember the conversation that we had at this moment.
Well, one of my abiding memories of Kathmandu is motorcycles.
Oh, right, right.
Somebody said there's something like 2 million motorcycles in Kathmandu.
That probably could be true.
Yes, and they all seem to be on the wrong side of the road.
Well, there is no traffic rules, as you may have witnessed.
Sort of every man and woman for themselves, and crossing the road can be quite an experience.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So I think we can start, David. It's 7:31. We are recording, so people who come later will be able. But we have, we talk about remarkable young people. So two of them have already joined us. Taryn has a special interest in transhumanism, and Amir has a special interest in longevity. So they're both here, and I'm sure more students will join with time. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, it's very good. So I'm sharing my screen. Hopefully you can see it.
Yes.
Yeah.
This is my presentation for this course on reimagining human flourishing from a particular point of view, transhumanism, that I believe to have very important things to say about the future of human flourishing. So I count myself as an advocate of transhumanism. I believe it is a sound, important, valuable framework of thinking. I'm also an interpreter, so some of the way that I'll describe transhumanism might be a bit different from how people have seen it before, although I believe my description of it is authentic. I'm also a critic of some of the things that happen within the transhumanist community, and I'll talk about that too. But before we get on to the transhuman, just a little bit about the human involved. This was me in October a couple of years ago with my better half. We've been married nearly 40 years, shockingly, and this was us at 4,100 meters above sea level in, can you guess, in the Annapurna base camp in Nepal. And it was just before we popped into the highest restaurant I'd ever been to, where we really enjoyed some hot chocolate and some pancake. Although that's 4,000 meters, we didn't go any further. The peak would have been 8,000 meters. There was a sign saying only qualified mountaineers further. Instead, we went down and we enjoyed some of the other wonderful aspects of Nepal, including this so-called Mona Lisa of Nepal, which is a wonderful wood carving from the 15th century. And there's lots of older parts of Nepal too. Here we are outside a stupa, which has been in place, not quite like this, but in previous forms since at least the 5th century. So I have fond memories of my time in Nepal. I should mention I have been in Canada, I think 6 times overall. Here you see us standing close to the Niagara Falls, and yes, I did get wet, and we enjoyed some very nice experiences. Although, sadly, I've never been to Edmonton. The closest I think I've been is to Calgary.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, now here's another part from my past, and I start to get a bit more serious now. I draw my ideas about transhumanism and ideas about the future from my own experience of a radical change. And so I lived for 25 years in an industry with lots of change. And so back in 1993, shockingly, 28 years ago, I was a lead software engineer for the product on the left. It's one of the earliest handheld mobile computers, which has built into it a word processor, a spreadsheet, a calculator, an agenda, and so on. And we were doing then, the company Scion, based in London, was doing what good companies are meant to do. We were extending our product concept significantly, incrementally. Creating a device came out 4 years later. This is the Series 5 with touch interface, with a more colorful screen, with a 32-bit operating system, and with more powerful apps. But at the same time, my colleagues and I realized that our world was about to be turned upside down. And eventually we drew this picture. You can see it from June 1998, in which we tracked our own trend, the trend we knew, which was computers becoming more mobile, smaller. And we plotted a collision with a more powerful industry that was coming our way, the phone industry. Back in 1998, there were quite a few mobile phones around, but most of them were pretty simple. But we knew the mobile phone industry was interested in the same kind of devices that we were making. And we wondered what would come of this transformation. And eventually we spun off a subunit to create versions of our own products suited for this new smartphone space, a new company called Symbian, which attracted significant investment from the three large mobile phone companies of that time. Some of you may remember them, Nokia, Ericsson, and Motorola. And we patiently built a platform that would encourage sharing of code, sharing of applications, sharing of device drivers, and so forth. And it was a disappointment, the way radical change often is, at least to start with. So we had the vision that smartphones would be widely adopted, but most people for a long time were quite content with their simpler phones, feature phones. And we were delayed in our revenues, our projects were delayed, and there were many philosophical arguments that this whole product family was a waste of time, that only a few people would be interested in smartphones. You would need to be a yuppie, an upwardly mobile professional, or possibly a geek, or possibly a drug dealer or something. But over time, the product did get better. Over time, a number of companies were very successful with these first smartphones, including, you can see there, a Canadian company, BlackBerry, which created RIM products, an American company, Palm, and then Motorola and Nokia and others shipping symbian smartphones. And after a while, after that disappointing period, we were doing very well. And eventually software that my teams and I wrote were in hundreds of millions of smartphones. And then the pattern repeated. There were another set of companies also interested in this space, West Coast companies. You can see them there, are Apple and Google's Android. And for a while, it was widely thought these companies would not be successful because they didn't understand mobile phones. Silicon Valley phones were very poor to start off with. And we also thought that the operating system Google was using, Linux, had failed again and again. But you can guess what happened next. Eventually, they were very successful too. So my first lesson, which applies, I believe, to many other technology areas, is the future arrives not in a steady pace, not in a simple exponential curve, but in disruptive waves. One difference between these different waves is how much software was involved. The first phones had comparatively little software, simple contacts management, and if you were lucky, you might have had a game called Snake, something like that. The first wave of smartphones had lots of software because these devices had powerful mini computers inside. But the more recent smartphones have been supercomputers with enormous amounts of hardware and correspondingly more powerful software. And this is a pattern which will repeat as we look at other types of technology areas, such as biotech, such as artificial intelligence. In fact, one of my themes for what's coming next isn't software is eating the world, which, by the way, is a saying attributed to a leading venture capitalist who previously had been the pioneer of web browsing, Mark Andreessen, whose work at the Mozilla had created Netscape. A more contemporary version of that for the future is software written by AI will be eating the world. I've written some of my experiences up in an ebook covering these 25 years, but I will draw out 4 lessons before I move on. The first lesson is disruption goes through this slow and disappointing phase before it goes to the fast and furious phase. And in the slow and disappointing phase, people keep saying, oh, not this idea again. We've heard it before. It's failed. It's not going anywhere. It's just hype. Before, in the fast and furious phase, people typically say, oh my God, why did nobody tell us this was coming? We could have prepared for it. It's hard to manage the disruptions. Disruptions don't just require technology, by the way. They require building an ecosystem of partners with feedback loops, not just smart devices, but also smart networks and application providers and smart application stores. You need to put a lot of people and companies and partnerships in place before the breakthrough happens. Yes, as I said, the disruptions tend to happen in waves, each new wave with new ideas, new tools, often new people driving it, outsiders. And to be clear, the outcomes of these disruptions are by no means inevitable. The impact of humans makes a key difference to whether the disruption is successful or fails. And that's a key theme I'll be developing further. So on to transhumanism. Transhumanism is not a vision of new phones, of course. It's a vision of a better world. A significantly better world with a significantly better social relationships with significantly better humans in it. Transhumanism isn't just a vision, however, it is a program of actions intended to make this vision more likely to come about more quickly and to be more sure that it has beneficial consequences. So there is recommendations for people working in areas of technology. There are also recommendations to steer the political landscape because technology is very influenced by the society and the politics in which it emerges. And transhumanism is also very much about changing the content of what people learn, transforming education, such as this course here and now is doing. Transhumanism is also a community. And I do hope that if you're not part of that community already, you will find people in it who can usefully help you along your transhumanist explorations. But I will explain transhumanism from the point of view of being an ethical framework. Ethical framework is about decisions for hard choices. And there will be lots of hard choices in the coming decades. Hard choices put in our face by the possibilities of biotech, infotech, nanotech, cognotech, and more, which I will describe. And ethics is about a choice where we could do something, where we might even want to do it, but from a different point of view, maybe we shouldn't do it. And where does this sense of should and should not come from? And how do we resolve these questions? That's what ethics is about. Some people say transhumanism is just about embracing technology regardless. That's completely wrong. Transhumanism does have its guidelines, strong guidelines for how to guide, steer, and embrace parts of technology. Now I'm going to start sharing some other data. And one aspect of having a good life is not dying very young. And I'd like to look at the chart of a life expectancy. And one reason I picked the UK, it's not just because I'm living there, it's because this is the longest continuous survey of life expectancy, going back to 1543, which is even before I was born, and even before Professor Solis was born. And this you can look up yourself on Our World in Data. I wonder if you can predict what this curve looks like. Let me fill it in. In the early years, there are some strange things happening, which are probably just some aspects of how these calculations have been done, the shortage of data, but you can see a pattern emerging, which is that there's little change for most of history. From 1543 to about 1860, the average life expectancy was not changed much on the whole. And then from 1860 to 1960, there was a rapid improvement. And since then, there's been a bit of a slowdown. And it's the same for other countries when you look at their charts too. Let me put on here 3 countries' charts, which don't go back so far, but you can see what's going on. The brown, as you can guess, is the UK. The green is a slightly healthier country, Canadians who live a little bit longer on average. And the other one there is the data, which I've taken from Our World in Data from Nepal, which is showing remarkable progress in the last few decades and possibly slowing down as well. Now we could look at other data on aspects of human well-being. This data reflects the average economic production of people, what people were doing that added value to the economy in terms of goods that could be bought and sold. And in the Bank of England in London, there are records going back this time all the way to 1270, quite remarkably. And these have been adjusted for inflation. Again, I invite you to think ahead what the curve might look like. And let me fill it in. Not much change for most of history, and then a rapid increase as people had more possessions, created more things. And you can see a couple of real world glitches there. After the First World War, after the Second World War, it dropped back a bit, and more recently after the 2008 financial crash. But the bigger picture is slow change followed by more rapid change. Now, we could look at many other statistics like this, but I'm going to defer to a summary by the economist Andrew McAfee at MIT, who's looked at lots of this data, and his conclusion is, let me read it. For thousands of years until the middle of the 18th century, there were only glacial rates of population growth, economic expansion, and social development. And then an industrial revolution happened, centered around the improvements James Watt made to the steam engine. And from then, humanity's trajectory, by many measurements, bent sharply and permanently upwards. And McAfee's interpretation is that the changes are due to the Industrial Revolution. Nothing changes the world like technology. And although what we learn at school is about great wars and empires, despots and democrats, none of these things have transformed people's lives practically as much as these inventions. And we could argue about this, but I think he's right. And I draw my own summary of history in a very simple chart. And I apologize, it's incredibly simple, but at a certain level, I believe this is a good representation of what's happened. It's showing increasing technological change driven by waves of new industrial revolutions. And these technological changes, to be clear, are bringing more opportunities for greater human flourishing, but also bringing more risks. Risks of nuclear destruction, risks of climate change, risk of other environmental catastrophes, risks of AI manipulating us with fake news, such as we're seeing, but also opportunities for greater human flourishing, such as transhumanism talks about. This arose from the wider understanding of the scientific method, an openness in society that allowed criticism of the authorities, that people could disagree with what Aristotle or Thomas Aquinas or other venerable ancient people had said. It was also an open society that allowed people to meet and create businesses. So James Watt, who improved the steam engine, went into celebrated an important business partnership with James Bolton, no, Matthew Bolton, let me get his name right, confusing other people. Anyway, so what happened is various waves of activity, in each wave impacting more of the world and having a bigger ultimate effect. So steam, mechanization, and trains. Then many historians talk about a second wave of the Industrial Revolution from around 1870 or 1880. Electricity gradually displacing steam, synthetic chemicals, new fertilizers, new explosives, new fabrics, new plastics, steel, the Bessemer steel process, and mass production. We talk about a third wave of the Industrial Revolution in which computers were displacing humans increasingly from the workforce, in which silicon integrated circuits were increasingly important, consumer electronics and cellular communications. And I'll talk about an NBIC convergence starting from around 2010, driving yet further change. But before I do that, I'll point out there is an acceleration of timescales here. Each new wave is tending to come more quickly than the start of the previous wave. And this is because of a phenomenon I'll explore as well, which people need to get their heads around: positive feedback cycles driving more change. NBIC, I've already talked briefly about this in my introduction. It is for associated sets of radical change. I is information technology, and I mean not just computing with bits, not just storing more bits, not just communicating with bits. All of that's the third industrial revolution. What's different nowadays is machine learning of big data and the transformation of artificial intelligence that is creating from about 2012 onwards. N is nanotech for manipulating atoms in a more systematic, more programmable way. So we can talk about not just existing types of chipsets, but new types of chipsets. We can talk about quantum computing. We can talk about new nanosensors and nanobots. B for biotech is understanding and enhancing the basis of our biology, genes, epigenes, proteomes, biomes, and so forth. And C is for cognitive technologies, where we understand and can enhance the makeup of our brains, our neurons. And in each case, there is an acceleration of change. I pick out 4 quadrants because this divides up in 2 dimensions. The top is, roughly speaking, hardware. The bottom, roughly speaking, is software. The left, roughly speaking, is physics. And the right is biology. But it's the combinations and the interactions which give the real power to this 4th industrial revolution. Just looking at some, we have better nanosensors, which allow us to sense what's happening inside human brains without having to cut people's skulls open. And the more we understand what's happening when people are being creative or intuitive or meditating, the more we can copy some ideas back into artificial intelligence, as we've done to an extent with neural networks, and as people are exploring doing in many other ways. And with better artificial intelligence, we can accelerate many changes in healthcare. So we'll look at other examples shortly, but let's just highlight the underlying theme of positive feedback cycles. The first industrial revolution had steam-powered machinery, which was built by fairly simple tools. But with better machinery, we could build better tools. And with better tools, we could build better machinery and so forth. Positive feedback. And we could also access more coal, which gave us more ability to do more things. And it's the same with each of the industrial revolutions. The new chemicals were created initially from a small set of chemical reagents, but the more chemicals we created, more new types of reactions were possible as well, leading to some very amazing things that can be done. With computers, initially they were assembled, manufactured almost by hand with hammer and nail, and they were designed on paper and pencil. But there is the discipline of computer-aided design and computer-aided manufacture, which can design and manufacture anything, including the next generation of computers. So one generation of computer can lead to the next generation of computers being better. It's the same with software. Software is written by humans who take advantage of software tools, software programs such as debuggers and compilers, so forth, which means that small teams of software engineers nowadays can do much more powerful things than correspondingly sized teams could do in the past. Well, that is the past, but looking forwards to the growth of AI, it's the same. AI is today created by humans, but with the help of some AI tools. And all the time, as AI improves, our AI tools improve, which allows us to do even more AI. And there are skeptics who say, oh, humans can never be replaced for such and such a task. But more and more, we are seeing AI tools which are taking over parts of that human task, allowing this to go faster. A couple of examples from recent newspaper headlines: the teaching of AI to humans is often being done now by AI algorithms with some help from humans, but more people can learn more quickly as a result. And not just the teaching of AI, actually the writing of AI. So this is a newspaper headline: Google's human researchers have taught machine learning software to build machine learning software that in some instances is more powerful and efficient than the best systems that human researchers themselves can design. So this is with the team inside Google known as Google Brain, headed up by Jeff Dean. It is positive feedback progressing. And one more example: better AI is often done by new types of chips. So not just the central processing units of bygone days, also GPUs, now TPUs, and in due course, quantum processing. But as we have better AI, the relationship works the other way. Here's another newspaper headline: Google is using AI to design chips that will accelerate AI. After all, the design of chips is a bit like solving 3D Tetris, as the newspaper headline explains. And the biggest positive feedback cycle of all is this one, in which there are more people in the world, which some people fear because it means more mouths to feed, more waste being generated. But equally, there are more brains being engaged, with better education than ever before. So people all around the world are able to tap into the best education online. People are increasingly networked, as we are now, networked around the world, sharing ideas. And as a result, it's no surprise that people are producing better tools and therefore better technology. But the better technology leads to better networks, and also the better technology leads to better online education resources. So that's why we have more scientists, more engineers, more entrepreneurs, more designers, more educators operating at a higher level today than ever before, creating more artificial intelligence and deep learning, leading to an acceleration of technology and, yes, an acceleration of disruption. Now, I've only touched the surface of this argument. There's a lot more that could be said, but let me step back a bit now and reflect on 4 different responses that people have to this possibility that technology is going to change the future more and more. Quite a lot of people take this approach. I call it techno-ignorant. They effectively put their head in the sands. They call themselves techno-skeptical. They say, yeah, there's a lot of hype, but they don't think it's for real. And it's true, there is a lot of hype, and a lot of what's discussed won't happen in the forms that's discussed, but underlying it, as I've argued, there are very powerful forces which probably will change human condition radically. And these people aren't actually putting their heads literally in the sand. They are being distracted by the issues and opportunities and problems of the present, which is important. We should look at the present and we should look at the incremental future, but that should not distract us from looking at these disruptive change possibilities. So I've tried to argue why that approach is wrong. Now, there is another approach by people who do see the changes coming and they don't like it. They want to say, whoa, slow down, stop, stop, stop. We don't like this gene editing. We want to ban gene editing until we're sure it's safe. We don't like new nuclear reactors. We want to put a moratorium on new nuclear reactors. We don't like AI. It's dangerous. Let's slow it down with lots of regulations. They don't call themselves technosuppressive. They typically call themselves techno-conservatives. I don't think this approach is viable because there is simply too much good potential, as well as the dangerous potential, but there is too much good potential with this technology. AI, after all, is having a very significant positive impact on healthcare opportunities. New drugs are being discovered, new methods for scanning to see whether people have got various pathologies, many other ways. So this cannot be stopped simply by holding up a hand. And although I understand why people try to do it, I think it's a bit like the old King Canute, who allegedly stood on the tide in the beach and said, go back, to demonstrate that it was impossible. Now, the tides are coming. There is another group of people who don't want to slow it down. They want to speed it up. I call them techno-promiscuous. And I looked all over the internet to get a good picture summarizing techno-promiscuity. I chose this one. It's people who basically want to have as much technology as possible, as quickly as possible, and they don't want these regulators to get in the way. They call themselves techno-libertarian. I see this as a dangerous approach because more technology won't just allow us to do good, it will allow bad people to do bad things. If we are cleverer, it won't necessarily make us wiser. And there are plenty of bad people in the world who are in powerful positions already. And if you give them more power, they may do even worse things. Giving power, well, let's remember the famous saying by Lord Acton, the 19th century historian and politician: power tends to corrupt. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. So we must be more careful. And the only viable approach, to my mind, is a different one, sometimes called techno-agile. The tools of that are a mixture of accelerator. Some things we want to accelerate. Some things we want to slow down by using the brakes. And yes, we need a steering wheel too. And this is by far the hardest of the four approaches, but it is the one that is absolutely necessary. Sometimes it's called techno-progressive. Sometimes it's simply called transhumanists, although there are some people who call themselves transhumanists who would instead identify more as techno-libertarians. But I want to argue that that is the approach we need. And it's hard. But after all, developing the technology is hard. Figuring out how to steer it, how to accelerate it, and how to slow it down as appropriate is likely to be hard too. So how do we decide then what to accelerate and what to slow down? I want to have a little detour here, looking at different kinds of answers to the question. Science and technology can tell us how to achieve various goals, but it can't tell us which of these goals we should be adopting. Science and technology can allow a couple to avoid having children with contraceptions, but it can't tell people whether they should use contraceptions. And after all, some religious traditions have said, no, you should not. Science and technology can tell women how to have an abortion in various circumstances, but it can't say whether that abortion should proceed. Increasingly, science and technology will allow a couple to choose the gender of a child to be implanted via IVF and gives the couple power over other genetic attributes. Is that something that should happen? Should a family be able to say they want to start their family with a boy, for example? Or if they've had 2 boys already, should they be allowed to say they want a girl next? In the future, science and technology may allow women to bypass pregnancy inside themselves altogether with external wombs, as described in, to an extent, the Brave New World novel by Aldous Huxley, Ectogenesis. It can tell us we could do it. It can't tell us should we do it. And we could say the same about drugs, nootropic drugs that will allow students to concentrate hard, to wake up early in the morning and be bright and alert, but it can't tell us whether we should be doing that or whether that's somehow cheating. And the same with radical life extension. Science and technology probably will be able to tell us soon how to live healthily for many more decades than before, but again, it can't tell us whether. So how do we decide which choices to take and which to resist, even though we might at some level want to take them? So transhumanism has a set of answers to these questions, but I want to talk about 4 types of answers. For most of history, most people would have said, it's easy. If you've got a moral dilemma, you consult the elders of your society, because the elders of society have been somehow in connection with a transcendental realm of divine beings who told us the answers, and it's written down in scriptures and holy books. And for most of history, that was what people did. They asked their priests or their wise women or their shamans or their gurus. But nowadays, this answer is not at all popular because, of course, there are many different conflicting divine beings who have given us conflicting answers on things like which food should we eat, whether or not they're delicious. They've given us different answers historically as to what we should do with slaves or multiple castes. Most ancient moral holy books seem to be quite happy and comfortable with slaves. And the laws about slaves in the Old Testament, they don't say free slaves, they say don't envy your neighbor's slave. Just after the bit it says don't envy your neighbor's wife, and just before the bit it says don't envy your neighbor's ox or axe. And principles on sexuality, principles on treating others. It's clear not only do the different divine beings or their representatives have very different messages, these messages are often fairly obviously rooted in the historical circumstances in which these faiths grew up. And so at the very least, whilst we can say we can gain some inspiration from these traditions, we need human interpretation. And we need to assess the different principles from a human point of view, which will take us on in a minute to the 3rd of the 3 principles for making these decisions. But the second I should refer, many parts of the world say, well, it's obvious how to make these decisions. We should copy nature. Nature is a system of balances. It's balances between east and west, summer and winter, life and death. And we should conform to these. Respect these natural balances, the yin and the yang. And there are human versions of that in systems of so-called natural society, like Confucianism, who talks a lot about the roles and responsibilities of rulers and ruled, elders and youngers, man and woman, and so forth. But this approach, whilst it is interesting, has fallen into disrepute too, because as we have looked at nature, it's obvious nature is not just wonderful, it is terrible. There are many awful things in nature, and we should not be judging human courses of action on how close we come to nature. After all, as in this saying from a senior editor at The Atlantic, nature wants 5 of your 7 children dead. It wants you dead by 50. Anything better than that has been brought to you by science and technology. People willing to, quotes, play God and do better than nature. And I should add, it's been done by, in many cases, good politics too, by public health initiatives, which has stopped people dying so young so often. Still, people fight back, and they tend to say, well, it's true there are nasty things in nature, but we humans can't, on the whole, do better. And the reason there are nasty things is they're sort of necessary for the good things. And there is even a saying in evolution after Leslie Orgel, a famous biochemist from Cambridge from the 1950s and 60s, who said, evolution is cleverer than you. And if you want to do intelligent design, you'll find that actually blind evolution has been more intelligent than you. But as we look around, as we look at the actual design of humans, we find lots of bad designs, frankly, glitches, kludges, as engineers would call them. Here I'm referring to the writings of a professor of evolution, Nathan Lentz, who talks about bad knees, head colds, useless bones, significant chunks of junk DNA, and other attributes such as the fact that primates, sort of by accident, lost the ability to synthesize vitamin C millions of years ago, which is why many humans suffered from scurvy. Anyway, nowadays, the predominant moral system is humanism, or variants of humanism, where we say we don't judge something by how good it conforms to nature or even how good it conforms to ancient holy scriptures. We use our own human criteria to evaluate and decide. It is honed by experience, by reflection, by community, but we don't place undue faith in any one authority, and we don't place nature on a pedestal. And I'll put a big tick beside all of that. Transhumanists take humanism as the starting point. And indeed, it adds more in. So we accept these principles, but, and here I've got one of the H+ symbols, which reflects how transhumanism builds on humanism. We have a few insights that we say need to be highlighted, which is this: the human species in our current form does not represent the end of our development, but rather a comparatively early phase. And we can go much better pretty quickly. We shouldn't put an undue priority on protecting all aspects of today's human nature. With wisdom and care, which will be difficult, but with wisdom and care, we can do a lot better. And that's really the core message of transhumanism. Let me explain it by looking at this simple picture. If you ask most people about human nature, they'll say, yeah, we are stupid sometimes, but that randomness somehow contributes to our greatness. Human nature is precious. It's dangerous to think of tampering with it, either because human nature was divinely created, or more recently, people have said, as I've mentioned, that we were uniquely evolved. But transhumanists say no. We have to look at this more objectively. Human nature is a mix of features, some of which we want to preserve, definitely. There are some wonderful features. Indeed, some of them we want to enhance. We say this is good, and in fact, it could be more. But there are other aspects of our human nature that we want to leave behind. They made sense, perhaps, in evolutionary times when our environment was very different, when there was little available sweet food, for example, when there were dangers in mixing with other tribes because of the different viruses that different tribes might carry. But we should now move forwards. But who should decide? And how do we make these decisions? And a lot of the hesitancy, the opposition, the suspicion of transhumanism is that we're going to decide this in a foolish or naive or a simplistic form. But we transhumanists say, no, we want to make these decisions to steer the future by gathering together the best of all of humanity 1.0. That's today's humanity, before we can move forwards to humanity plus. And here I've got the symbol from probably the world's leading transhumanist organization, Humanity Plus. And by the best of humanity, I mean the best of all aspects of science. So the insights of biology and psychology, sociology, economics, and more as to what is possible and what's not possible, and other aspects of culture. We want to bring in people who are got insights, important things to say, not just from one or two cultures, but from multiple cultures around the world. And not just the people who know what is being true in history and what's true today, but people who've got the artistic, creative imagination to say, well, this is how it is, but possibly this is how it could be. This is what is good today, but this could be good in the future. This is what we can do today. This is what we might be able to do in the future. So let's bring together these Imagineers, but then we have to critically evaluate the different ideas, demonstrating, therefore, collective wisdom. And we have to go step by step forwards. And in case that seems a bit vague, let me flesh out what people call the 4 supers of transhumanism. I've got 4. Other people draw 3. In a minute, if we've time, I might go on and draw 5. But let's highlight some of the actual changes that transhumanism are recommending. So super longevity, super intelligence, super happiness, and super democracy. And in each case, we are pointing to destructive or dangerous aspects or detrimental aspects of today's human nature. And we are pointing to ways in which technologies, the NBIC revolution and others can help us to transcend. So our physical body has attributes that make us decay, make us weak, make us become decrepit, but there are lots of aspects of rejuvenation biotechnology which can help us transcend. We are collectively stupid. We have got what psychologists call cognitive biases. We have many mental blind spots. These can be transcended by various improvements from information technology and cognitive technology. Our emotional self has various destructive characteristics. We are too egotistical at times. We are too prone to depression, to alienation, and to other vicious emotions and suffering that doesn't have any constructive redeeming features. We can do better than that. And the 4th quadrant looks at our characteristics towards social relationships. We do have various tendencies towards xenophobia, fear or dislike of strangers. We are divisive. We are prone to deceive each other. One reason our brains grew, evolutionary biologists speculate. There are 2 reasons why our brains grew so much. One is we had to handle more complicated collaboration, but equally we had to handle more complicated networks of deception. Who knew what? Who could be deceived about what? And sad to say, that is probably how we grew our brains and our survival at certain parts of our history. But this tendency for deception and self-deception is no longer a positive asset. And we can reprove all that with greater social inclusion and resilience whilst upholding diversity and liberty. Now, each of these quadrants could become a 2-hour dive in its own right, but I will look at the superdemocracy a little bit more because I've seen this discussed in some of the previous sections of the course. People were asking what's the right political structure to steer us through the challenges of the next couple of decades. So I'll spend a couple of minutes on that. And then since I've been talking quite a while already, I'll take a view as to how much else to cover before opening for questions. So to describe superdemocracy, I'll start with this definition, which some of you may recognize as being included by Abraham Lincoln in his Gettysburg Address as his description of democracy. And it's quite a profound description. Government of the people, by the people. And to break that down, of the people means that people are being governed. It means there are some restrictions that the government is imposing. Some things we might like to do, we are restricted from doing. For example, we might like, now this wasn't Abraham Lincoln's example, but I'll flesh out what a 2021 version of Abraham Lincoln might have said. We might like sometimes to make our own decisions about whether we can drive, having drunk various amounts of alcohol, but society thinks on the whole that is bad, and it's better for all of us if we have a constraint. We have to respect speed limits, despite sometimes individually wanting to go faster, because it's better for all of us. And there are constraints on pollutions, on carrying firearms, and so forth. So democracy is about some restrictions on the people, administered by who? by the people, by representatives. In part, they are judges and civil servants, and in part, these representatives are voted by the people, and critically, this is a key part, of course, of democracy, the representatives are subject to removal. If you have a system of government in which there is no way to get rid of your president, no alternative parties, that's not a democracy. So subject to removal in elections, although people are meant to be able to give advice, not just at the times of elections. A democracy should be able to listen to the wisest voices, not just the loudest voices, and contributing all throughout the electoral cycle, not just at the time of voting. And who are these restrictions for? They are for the people. They are for all of the people, not just the elite, not just for the party that happens to be in power, not just for any complex, some groups such as the military-industrial complex or corporations. Democracy does not exist for the flourishing of big pharma or big oil or big tech. It exists for all the people. It does not exist for press barons nor for politicians. Well, that's the principle of democracy, but it puts a lot of responsibility on people. And as been said, the best argument against democracy is, don't know if you know the end of this statement, the best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter. This has been attributed, this statement, to Winston Churchill, although probably he didn't actually say it. Nowadays, the best argument against democracy is spending 5 minutes scrolling through Twitter or Facebook and seeing the ridiculous things we all say. Anyway, democracy depends upon us humans, as people, having, as Taran said earlier this week, having autonomy and being educated in principles such as critical thinking, some knowledge of history, I would say also knowledge of foresight skills, and other support too. And unless we get this autonomy and education right, it's likely that democracy will be increasingly subverted by powerful forces such as press barons or politicians or competing powers and so on. So transhumanism's answer, in part, it is this formula that we will have better people and better people will give us better politics. We will have better politicians and better voters, better journalists, better analysts, better educators. But that's quite far off, and we need changes happening faster. So what I actually mean by super democracy, why there's a fourth quadrant in this picture, is a bit more. So let's rephrase this definition. Super democracy means government of the people and technology, by the people, aided by technology, for the people. So we people need to constrain what technology in some ways is developed and not. And our wisdom can be accelerated by technology, which will do things like real-time fact checking. When people say things, there'll be little bubbles popping up saying, actually, this doesn't seem to be true. Checking the logic of arguments, checking the sources of material, checking the reputations of people who are saying things. This person is saying this, but actually this person doesn't have much track record in this field. Or contrary, this person has got a good track record of saying things which have been judged correct. Then we can use AI to help not just evaluate viewpoints, but even to propose viewpoints, creatively synthesizing different views. And it can run simulations, models, in which different possible regulatory systems can be evaluated. So that's part of super democracy. But actually the most important parts are two inventions, which actually are old inventions, but need to be supported much more. Arguably the two most important inventions of the last few hundred years, by some criteria, are the mixed economy and separation of powers. By the mixed economy, I mean that we take advantage of the benefits of what the free market can do. It's often remarkable, but we recognize there are failure modes in free market competition, and we need to oversee the market with various amounts of regulations and subsidies, which ensure that negative externalities are not ignored, but they are built into the decisions, and indeed positive externalities are supported. And this has to be done in a way that's agile. Whereas many people are afraid that regulations will hamper and restrict creativity unnecessarily, that's only true if we have poor quality regulators. Let's have better people aided by technology doing these regulations. The mixed economy and separation of power also points to industrial strategy. Government should occasionally be getting involved to drive various investments, which the free market by itself will not do, because private investment is more impatient. It wants faster returns. And we can talk about the freedom of press, which is vital. People need to be able to criticize. I also think there needs to be more penalties for people who knowingly lie, as there are penalties already for advertisers who distort facts, and there are penalties for people who give information about their companies that are financially wrong. There should be penalties for politicians who knowingly lie in the same way. And we could talk at more length about practical extensions of these ideas into things like citizens' assemblies, liquid democracy, reputation systems, which ideas have been around for a while, haven't taken off yet, but which could take off much more quickly as AIs support us. So there we are. 4 dimensions of rejuvenation, actually 5 dimensions. Transhumanism talks about rejuvenating the body and the mind and our emotional well-being and our political structure, but possibly the most important of all is rejuvenating our vision, our sense of what's possible. We need to give people around the world a credible set of ideas about how the world can be transformed, a set of stories, a narration, if you like, which inspires, engages, and is inclusive, will bring along lots of people. We might call this supervision, except that word means something else. Might call it a super narrative or a technoprogressive vision. And to spell out this technoprogressive vision, I've covered most of it already, but just to put it on one page, it is that there will be a sustainable superabundance for all, potentially as early as 2040, by taking wise advantage of these NBIC technologies. An abundance of clean energy via more directed and accelerated green technology, an abundance of healthy food, material goods, affordable health, all-round intelligence, an abundance of time for creativity, an abundance of space to explore externally and internally, and an abundance of collaboration and democracy. And I'd sort of like to stop there, but I really shouldn't, because that's not the only vision that's on the cards. As much as transhumanism would like this to be the only possible vision, there is a much worse vision. In case these NBIC technologies are badly managed, we will end up with a humanitarian tragedy. Instead of an abundance, we can talk about a preponderance of polluting energy if green technology is not developed sufficiently in time. A preponderance of malnutrition, waste and biohazard, chronic disease, unwise cleverness, soul-destroying toil, overcrowding, and instead of a collaboration, we can have more inequality and tribalism, driving people to do increasingly desperate, increasingly crazy, increasingly destructive things. And to stop that, possibly the most important thing in here is social tech. Social tech fits in this picture roughly here, right at the heart. And just as nanotech is about atoms, biotech's about genes, infotech's about bits, and cognitech's about neurons, social tech is about flows of value. And we could open the kimono. We could spend a long time looking at these are the 20 big ways in which the world might change in the next 20 years. And there's more in terms of combinations, but none of this is guaranteed to work in a good way unless we get this social technology right. Flows of finance to the projects and people who most need it. Flows of information that protects and respects privacy and security. Making sure the market works for the benefits of all by the right regulatory technology. And most important of all, improving education and, as I've sort of touched on, in improving politics. Well, I've been going for about an hour. There's a few more things ideally I would like to have covered, but at this stage, I'm going to pause and see what Kim or Taryn would like to say, or indeed anybody else who has joined us this early in the Canadian morning or from Nepal.
Yeah, well, it's a very nice symmetry here. There are 10 of us, and 5 of those people are from Nepal. So yeah, I'd be interested in the Nepalese perspective. If someone would like to tell us your reaction so far and how relevant and valuable this is to your situation. So any thoughts about that? You could unmute. Well, maybe you can ponder that. Does anyone else? Yes, Arjun.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank you, David, and to Kim as well for connecting us and enabling us to attend this meeting. These are very powerful ideas and a lot of rich perspective on different things. And all in all, it basically makes a lot of sense to me. My colleagues may have something to add on. The one thing that bothers me, and maybe you have some suggestion to it, is that while transhumanism as a concept is a very powerful tool as to how shall we handle technology, or how should we deal with the rapid advancement in technology, as David has suggested, kind of a progressive, efficient and effective advancement, one thing leading to another. But in real life, there is such a huge divide between the so-called north-south divide. Countries which would have probably benefited from the technology are grappling with very fundamental problems like poverty and different kind of injustices, people not having access to education, to healthcare, and all these things. So from the perspective of the transhumanism, what would be the approach to take in bridging this gap between the have and have-nots in terms of the access to and benefit of technology?
A very important question. Shall I answer now, or do you have more to say?
No, for the time being, this is what I have to say. Maybe other colleagues
may
have
in a minute.
Yeah.
Well, let me talk about the poverty. Actually, there's another chart which I missed out, also from Our World in Data, which shows that although, of course, there's still far too much poverty in the world, the proportion of people, actually the number of people, the proportion of people who are in absolute poverty has come down a lot, especially in the last 20 or 30 years. And why has it come down? It has come down because there are improvements in things like manufacturing, there are improvements to agriculture, and there are improvements to politics, improvements in economics. So there's more to be done. I don't want to belittle that at all, but as we have more of the technology of abundance, it can transform more and more countries around the world and more parts of more countries. Access to healthcare is a particularly challenging thing. Almost every country in the world has some crisis in healthcare. I'd say this even before we consider the COVID pandemic. In more and more countries of the world, people are spending more money on healthcare, and it hasn't actually always produced a big change in statistics. I did show the improvements in lifespan has slowed down. And if we looked more closely, we'd find in many parts of the world, the health span is shrinking. So people may live longer, but in the last portion of their life, they're spending more years in a disabled state or a poor state of health. So there is crisis in healthcare all over. And the solution to that is the technologies of abundance. Again, it is to accelerate rejuvenation biotechnology, which will address the root cause of almost every illness, which is that bodies get older and are no longer as fit and as healthy as before. Who tends to die of COVID? It is the people who are older, exponentially so, in fact. Of course, there are some very sad cases of people dying when they're young. Too many, of course, but preponderance of people who die is when they're older. And it's the same with all diseases. It's the same with cancer. It's the same with heart disease. It's the same with diabetes. It's the same with dementia. If we're really serious about preventing these outbreaks of ill health, we should look at the root condition, which is the underlying biological aging. And the transhumanists believe, and have got good evidence, I would say, that there are mechanisms which we can copy in part from nature. And there are other mechanisms which we can design ourselves to periodically reverse the damage of aging. And these would not be as expensive as the cure. After all, if you go to the dentist occasionally, if you brush your teeth every morning and evening, you don't need to end up having very expensive dental treatments. A stitch in time saves nine, as in a famous English language saying. It will be the same with these rejuvenation therapies. A small set of interventions on a regular basis will cost much less and will allow us to have a much better quality of life. Some economists refer to this as the longevity dividend. It's a concept that's been around for about 30 years, but it's coming into increasing public understanding that if we spend money in the right way early enough, we have enormous economic positives. Why? Because we don't have so many people falling sick and being a net negative from a financial and economic point of view. I extend this concept of the longevity dividend to a technoprogressive dividend. If we accelerate investment in things like clean energy, much more so than is currently being done. I look at what Joe Biden in America is talking about. That is a good start. And we should have the Green New Deal accelerated. If we spend money like that, it will avoid us having to spend more money fixing problems later on. So in broad terms, that's what's possible. And I would point to individual examples around the world where countries have managed to pull themselves up remarkably out of a state of poverty.
Yeah, I wonder whether leapfrogging is also something worthy of discussion. You can take where resource limited countries are today and say it's just an enormous challenge to get them up to speed. But through leapfrogging, you can leave out a lot of steps that have been gone through in the past and go right from having no communications at all to high-end cell phones with the people never having encountered maybe landline phones ever. That's fine.
Exactly.
So, yeah. So
the first time I visited Korea in the early 1980s, it was definitely a third world country. I was horrified to see the amount of poverty on the streets. It was a real shock to me. But every time I've gone back to South Korea, I felt that they are a more and more advanced country, and my own country, Britain, has been the one that's falling behind. So they have been able to leapfrog in various ways because they haven't needed to duplicate everything that other countries have done. And there are shining examples in parts of Africa as well. It varies, of course, a lot from country to country, but you're exactly right, Kim. There are opportunities to leapfrog. We look at some of the financial systems. The countries that were quickest to adopt digital money on their mobile phones was Kenya, to start off with the M-Pesa system. And the people who previously had no bank account were exchanging money in such a way. That's where the fastest innovation took place there. And I think it can be the same often in countries which are outside of the current main wave. That's how disruption often happens in industry. It's from new groups of people who are bold enough and free enough to try something differently.
Taryn, do you have questions or comments?
I don't know. I love, this was a great talk. I really, it's resonated a lot with me. I think with the leapfrogging and it's hard for me to understand or consider how this can be done. It needs to be done collaboratively, right? It needs to be done in a way that's not just forcing this technology on other people, right? How do we balance that? How do we balance developing new technology in, the developed world, at the same time encouraging this adoption of technology in other places when, those places aren't culturally the same? Do you know what I mean by that?
Respecting the diversity of cultures, I think, is very important. I don't want to say that all cultures should be respected in the same way. I do see that there are some cultures which deserve to be changed, particularly cultures that have discriminated against girls' education, for example. I think sometimes we should say, no, these cultures are detrimental to overall human well-being. But on the other hand, there is a great diversity in positive cultures too. It's a bit like diet. We can't say there is one unique best food ever. There is lots of good food and there's lots of bad food. So we can say that some diets are better than others without saying everybody needs to eat this particular food all the time. How do we cope with that? Well, we need to avoid monoculturalism. We need to encourage diversity within the movement, the transhumanist movement, and we need to be able to listen and learn and to express ourselves in new ways as we come across new mental models in different parts of the world and new frameworks.
So other comments?
Can I make a comment?
Sure.
Sure, thank you. It's really, thank you, David, for a very wonderful presentation. I missed some of this first 5 or 10 minutes, but I could find the overall discussion and presentation is very futuristic and very comprehensive. So if I allow to speak from the perspective from such a very developing country like Nepal, what I see, what do you call this, a positive implication for such kind of very comprehensive approach is usually sometimes to apply in a positive way the technology or this technical innovation or technical this positive aspect for social or problem solving or democracy is sometimes it's easier in developing country. For instance, this congestion price, road pricing was discussed innovated by British economists in 50s or 60s, but that was implemented by Singapore in 1972 when Singapore was still a very developing country. That now this real-time road pricing using this IT technology, it's worldwide. So in that sense, what I see, some of the aspects such as it is making democracy most responsive, or what David call it, this super democracy. Like I just read this week in The Economist, there was a very interesting article and questioning the future of the democracy, where the Economist is supposed to be a mouthpiece of the liberal democracy. But there is a big, this questions on if we continue the current practice of democracy, especially after this January 6th, this event from the US. So we need to repair, or we need to have some real, what do you call this, people-centric and what do you call this, really people-solving democracy. And that I find very interesting, these narratives in David's presentations, how the technology can really make a democracy, it's more functional. And that it's very much applicable to a country like Nepal also. We are also discussing about our democracy is dysfunctional, our electoral system is not very transparent and very fair. So I can see this many of this technology application in making democracy real functional in developing country. Of course, the problem of the democracy in developed country is different kind of the problem in developing country as well. It's more technical nature. For instance, the voting machine, transparency in our government performance and that. So like the question of the leapfrogging, that kind of scope is here in a country like Nepal. And finally, I have a comment on the questions. Mostly what I find is it's a feedback loop, this feeding in a reinforcing cycle. But when we are discussing about a comprehensive system of including technology, society, value, and democracy, and all those things, I think there are also the negative feedback loops, that is called a balancing cycle, or what is the goal seeking. And if we are able to combine this positive feedback and negative feedback, that constitute what you call the complex system, and then we can discuss it as a both reinforcing cycle and the goal seeking system. And if we are because overall tone or the narratives of David's presentation, what I find is most of this suggestive narrative is the very normative. It should be like that. On the other hand, if we are able to identify some leverage point, especially if we could identify some element that determine the system's goal, and if we could, introduce, or we could identify some negative feedback loop goal-seeking system, so sometimes the system would automatically, if we could identify the leverage point, then that will lead to a more desirable system goal-seeking. And I think that would, that would help the society to steer it towards the more sustainable line. What we otherwise is discussing as a normative goal that might turn out to be the descriptive and these positive goals. That is my just comment. And this, finally, the question says it's really very interesting framework. So. Is the work in progress? Are we going to expand it, or the further, like the comment I made, to also include this balancing feedback loop, or the system, how the system itself is regulating or balancing it, or we are leaving it as an exogenous practice? Thank you, David, very much for your attention.
A great set of comments. Thanks. I am developing this theory as we speak. I'm in the course of writing a new book, which sets out these ideas in much more length. Sadly, it's about 500 pages already, and I'm not sure publishers are going to like it, so I'm going to have to figure out what to do with all this material. But I think the story does need to be told, and it is normative, but the ideas on what should happen come out of an analysis of what is possible. And we do need to be aware of what's happened in history. We do need to see these negative feedback loops as well. You're quite right. There are things that will clamp down activity as well as things that will accelerate activity. And one example you mentioned, the tax system proposed by the Cambridge economist Arthur Pigou in the 1950s, which was on congestion charge, but they either idea from that is a carbon tax, which I believe absolutely needs to be done. Why? If there is a carbon tax in place, it will reorient how much of industry operates. Instead of trying to keep on using oil, it will incentivize people to accelerate the adoption of sustainable clean energies. So you're quite right. By finding the right leverage point, things can change as well. And we should not just be victims, fatalistically thinking this is going to spin out of control. We should absolutely be getting involved. In terms of transforming how democracy works, I think countries can learn from each other. An example I've looked at, I touched on briefly in my slides, was a citizens' assembly. It's a bit like a jury. You know, members of the public are sometimes invited to form a jury, and they're not experts, but they spend time together and they can hear the presentations on particular topics. They can call in experts, and then they make a decision. So citizens' assemblies was the idea that from time to time, we would bring ordinary members of the public together in a way that reflects the makeup of society. So it's quite hard to choose the right makeup. And this has been done quite well in a number of countries. Ireland, for example. Ireland used to be a pretty traditional country with lots of Catholic heritage. It was against abortion, it was against gay marriage and so forth. But a couple of years ago, they got a citizens' assembly together and they spent time, a number of weekends, debating and calling in experts. And they came up with recommendations as to the wording of referendum question to be put to the whole country. And because it had been thought through carefully, many people who previously might have wanted to say, no, we should not encourage abortion at all, they would change their minds because that discussion had taken place. And as a result of these successful examples, other countries are trying it too. So a similar citizens' assembly took place in South Korea on the very controversial subject of what to do with nuclear power stations, because they were frightened by what had happened in Fukushima in Japan. But on the other hand, they were afraid that if they turned off all the nuclear power stations, they would run into difficulties. And again, they had successful, it seems, consultation. Now, other citizens' assemblies have not worked so well. Emmanuel Macron in France said he was going to do Le Grand Debate, a big debate. And it seems to have actually not worked so well because, and we could go into the details there too. So, but ideas that do work to augment and support democracy can be copied from one country to another. And I'm sure we in countries like Canada and the United Kingdom can learn from some of the innovations that countries like Nepal can do because of their unique heritage and different constraints and, frankly, different ideas.
Okay, great. Well, we're at the end of the session, and
do I have 2 more minutes to quickly run
sure.
through the final slides?
Yes, certainly.
Because they sort of summarize and highlight them, if you don't mind,
certainly.
just for the sake of the video, to round off the story, if I may.
Certainly.
Just let me press the right button here. I've been talking about values, and I said in the previous slide that, you know, values really needed to come to the fore. We need to get these systems right, but I want to dive in a little bit further just to summarize what I claim should be sort of 13 core transhumanist values, the things that we really want to tell the world. And there's 4 giving context that there are radical opportunities ahead. The near future can be radically better for everyone than the present. Human condition can be very significantly improved, but equally there are radical risks, existential dangers. The near future can be radically worse than the present because of misuse of powerful technology, which can be catastrophic. And I put this out there at the very beginning because I want to encourage people not just to think about the opportunities and dangers of everyday living today. They are significant, but if we just focus on these, we may miss even bigger dangers and bigger opportunities ahead. And the difference between going down the positive future and the negative future is human agency. Critically, the difference between these 2 options depends upon what we humans do, what we think, and what we decide and what we actually do. So human agency is at the heart of transhumanism. And just to underline this, there are no easy options. If we say, oh, this sounds a bit complicated, it sounds a bit dangerous, I'll concentrate on other things instead. If we all get distracted, if we fail to understand it, if we are frightened, frankly, that's more likely to bring about the existential danger. So that's the context. What are we upholding as the ends? It is human well-being, but not in a simple feeling good way. It's a breadth of different kinds of things. It's being really alive. It's being really free. It's being creative and so forth. And this is a big project, figuring out which aspects of well-being to prioritize even more than others. And this is a decades-long project, but we need to ensure this is what is at the heart of our decisions as a society, not boosting GDP, not boosting efficiency, not boosting productivity, it's boosting well-being. And to be clear, individuals matter. We are not a collectivist philosophy. Individuals are not ends. Sorry, individuals are not means. They are ends. We don't believe, as other philosophies have done, in sending individuals to die for a greater cause. No, everybody's well-being matters. But we should balance that by recognizing our mutual responsibility. We are stronger together. So that's a summary of what we want to achieve, what we want to keep in mind. And the means to pursue that, yes, let's understand scientific principles and rationality and respect them and apply them as appropriate. And let's ensure that our ideas are grounded in reality. So before we are normative, to return to the last question, we must be descriptive and analytical too. And to be clear, openness is paramount. There is no one book or idea or tradition that has absolute priority. Of course, we should respect various people and traditions when they are found to be good sources on the whole, but there is no pope in transhumanism. We are all open. And by the way, we should be vigilant in our openness. We should expect the unexpected. We should be constantly monitoring for new risks and new opportunities arising for ways we haven't foreseen. That means we prefer actions that are reversible. And a hard principle, but one that's necessary, is we should design for change so that when the unexpected happens, we are not caught flat-footed. The last three principles are extensions of what I've said before. We should not sacrifice the future for the present. We are in this for a sustainable superabundance, as is the title of one of my books. And it's not just human well-being, frankly. It's the well-being of all consciousness. What's the limit of consciousness? That's an ongoing, decades-long project too, but certainly we should avoid unnecessary suffering and detrimental treatment for animals and various post-humans. And lastly, there's a point that I brought up in discussing the point made by Taryn. Within the overall transhumanist framework, there are lots of options. So we should cherish, in fact, and nurture these diverse opinions and lifestyle. Why? Actually, we are not just stronger together, we are stronger with variety. We will learn more from these diverse points of view and lifestyles. And also, we cannot grow if we are presenting a monoculture. I've written more about many of these things in various books that are here already. You're welcome to dip into them. There's quite a lot of material online about each of them. But I also, as I mentioned, are rewriting some of this in a form that's appropriate for now, 2021, because I think, if anything, the dangers are greater, but also the opportunities are greater than ever before.
Great. Yes, well, that is a very satisfying and complete feeling, but you can imagine all the different ways in which one could extend these discussions, but it is a very satisfying discussion today. And we, from the Western world, will meet again at 2 to talk about these things and to talk about this video. but the people in Nepal will be sleeping then, and we'll just keep our fingers crossed that we also accomplish a lot in that session from 2 to 3:20. And thank you very much for joining us today, and we'll keep this collaboration going. I was very honored that so many of you were here today. That is something wonderful, beyond my wildest dreams. You know, we can make this course really relevant if this kind of worldwide input keeps happening. So, Arjun, thank you very much.
Kim, can I make a comment?
Certainly, yeah.
The fact, because of the, on the one hand, the time difference could be a challenge, but we would like to, we don't want to deprive ourselves from benefiting from such very, very rich and innovative perspective and ideas. So I think in one of your email, you suggested that you would like to put this recorded in a YouTube or something, this recorded presentation.
Yes.
So if you could put us in the link, that is, even though we may not be able to directly interact in real time, but at least we could be benefiting from the concept, from the ideas.
Certainly, yes.
That would be articulated.
Yeah, no way. I'll send you the link both from the video from this session and also the one at 2, and also subsequent ones in the course. And we're talking next in the course about space. I think space and going to other worlds is relevant in Nepal and many of the other things in the course. I think you would find interesting. So yes, certainly we will keep sending you those links. I am very pleased you've joined us today, and I think we can do a lot more things like this in the future. And I look forward to that.
And we are very grateful to David as well as to you, Kim.
Yes. Well,
for providing us such opportunity.
Yeah, no, I think it's really great to like bring these areas of intellectual inquiry together and to merge the cultures of Nepal, the UK, and Canada, and the US, and see what we can make of these questions in a grand sphere. So anyway, we'll keep on trying to do that. Thank you for this session, and I look forward to many others like it. Okay, great. Bye-bye now.